Hi, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the Heurich House Museum, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening during DC Beer Week for Tek Cyear, a panel discussion. Tonight's panel is based on a series written by Jamaal Lemon for Good Beer Hunting, with supporting research from Brian Alberts, Mike Stein, and Peter Jones. I'm really excited to introduce you all to them shortly. My name is Jenna Fabrizio, and I'm the Education Manager here at the Heurich House Museum in Washington, DC. The DuPont Circle Mansion was the home of German immigrant and Washington, D.C. brewer Christian Heurich, and here at the museum, we explore the American dream through Heurich's legacy. So during this discussion, we're going to find out what the Charleston Schützenfest, a historic German-American shooting tournament, has to do with racial hierarchy in beer culture. We'll look at how relationships between German immigrants and Black people changed over time. We'll explore shifting notions of whiteness and also think about how racial barriers were created, maintained, and normalized in beer culture. So now for some introductions. Jamaal Lemon, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, is a beer journalist, podcaster, and home brewer. He's a writer for Good Beer Hunting and a Huckberry Journal contributor. Jamaal is part of the North American Guild for Beer Writers, the DC Brewers Guild, and the DC Home Brewers Club. In 2016, he was the World of Beer Drink It intern, and in 2020, he received the NAGBW Award for Best Commentary for Mutated Anxieties. Michael Stein is president of Lost Lagers, Washington, D.C.'s premier beverage research firm. His historic beers have been served at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History and the Polish ambassador's residence. Senior staff writer at DC Beer, his work appears in Washington City Paper, Brewery History Journal, Good Beer Hunting, and Cider Craft Magazine. Brian Alberts is a historian, writer, and podcaster specializing in 19th century German immigrants and beer culture in the Midwest. He received his doctorate from Purdue University in 2018 and has since written for Good Beer Hunting, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post, as well as contributed to museum exhibits, conferences, educational events, and historically minded collaboration beers. His secret goal is to prove that beer is more American than apple pie. Peter Jones is CEO of the Lost Lagers beverage research firm, whose goal is to bring the past alive through beer. He has contributed research to dozens of historic beers and other beverage recreations, most notably finding the Korean War era lab report detailing Christian Heurich's Senate lager. In his day job, he is a researcher for historically driven litigation. So just a very big warm welcome to you all. So first we'll explore some topics with the panel, and then at the end we'll welcome questions from the audience as well. Thank you all for tuning in. We do have a Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom, and feel free to add in any questions you have throughout there, and we'll get to those at the end. So let's just dive right in. So to begin, the historic Schützenfest is central within your series. So I'm just going to start out opening up this to everyone. Can you tell us what exactly a Schützenfest is? Anyone want to start off?
Go ahead, Brian.
Brian. Okay. All right, I've been voted in. Yeah, so a Schützenfest is a German tradition. So it started in Germany, going back as far as the Middle Ages. It's kind of primarily from the southern and western parts of what is now Germany, and including places like Switzerland and things like that. And you'll have these kind of these Schützenbunds, which are rifle clubs. They're kind of like civilian militias, basically private militias. And a Schützenfest is kind of their annual like carnival / shooting tournament. So there's a lot of ceremony to it. There's often kind of a ceremonial wooden eagle that gets put up on a pole, like a way up high on a pole, and the entrants, which have to be club members, will shoot at it. And there's also target shooting competitions. But if you during the main event kind of shoot off, say, the wing of the eagle or the head of the wooden eagle or things like that, no real eagles are harmed in the procession of a Schützenfest. There's prizes, there's prestige associated with it. And if you're not personally a member of the club, the public tends to be very heavily involved. There's games like carnival style games, there's music performances, dancing, and of course as much beer as you could possibly drink. So we focused on the Charleston Schützenfest, which had a lot of these characteristics. It was not by any means the only Schützenfest that got kind of carried over. by German immigrants to the United States. They were basically in every major city. They were also in tons of smaller towns, all the way from Augusta, Georgia, all the way up to New Glarus, Wisconsin, which, any beer geeks in the audience know New Glarus pretty well. So Charleston's started at a kind of typical time for a lot of these fests around the mid 1850s. It obviously was kind of paused during the Civil War. And then in the late 1860s, it gets revived again. And that's the most interesting part for us, because that's when it starts undergoing this massive transformation from kind of that German cultural event that I mentioned just now, to essentially becoming a beacon of white supremacy in the city. And the process by which that was done had long-lasting implications, for modern Charleston beer culture.
Thank you so much for that overview, Brian. That's really helpful. So the next question is for Jamaal. So in the article, you start off describing a personal experience that you had at a brewery, and you also connected it to a Gullah Geechee proverb, and that proverb is "Must take care to root, fahil the tree," which for everyone tuning in translates to the importance of taking care of the root before a tree can heal. So do you mind telling us more about your personal experience, and also what does this proverb mean to you, and how does it connect to your story and this Schützenfest story?
A lot of ways. So the idea, or like the title, came to me maybe about 2 weeks after I was brought onto the project. And at this time, my buddy KJ and I was down in Charleston. Every time I go home, I always call up one of my good friends, KJ. And so we went over to a local brewery down in Charleston in the city. We're just enjoying our pints, hanging out, and just hanging out, having conversation. And then he asked the question that I get asked a lot by a lot of my African American friends: is like, "Yo, where are all the Black people?" And he was kind of saying it in jest, but that, for whatever reason, that particular time, I was like, I got it. I know exactly how, as far as like the project is concerned, I know exactly how to tackle this thing and what to call it and everything. So "Must take care to root" is like, I really wanted to kind of like start with like stereotypes, especially coming from Charleston, where it's very Black and white, unfortunately, for a lot of different reasons, because you get like a lot of stereotypes. Black people only do this, white people only do that. Black people don't do this, white people do this, and vice versa. And you can go, and it goes on and on with like so many different things. And just my personal life, I looked at my own life, whereas and it's been a constant since I was a kid. Like, I've always been a lot of times like the only Black kid in like a lot of different spaces. And I've always been fine with that, because I've always been comfortable with who I am. So I have all these different friends, and I'm always very comfortable with whether it's like a group of all my Black friends or all my white friends or my Asian friends or whatever. Like, I'm just going to continue to be Jamaal. So I took all of that and then just really tried to focus on the stereotypes. Okay, if we're saying that Black people don't drink beer, or Black people don't specifically, Black people don't drink craft beer, well, why is that? There's a fingerprint for everything. And in my opinion, specifically for Charleston, I think the Schützenfest is that fingerprint, because it was a lost potential to where, it could have been a lot of involvement into the beer industry now. And then Charleston's like there's no other city like Charleston in the US. And people from Charleston are very arrogant when they say things like that, and I'll accept that. But like, it's true, like our cuisine, our dialect, the landscape for the most part is like very different than any other city that you would go to. So I just think of that, like, what could have been, what could have been if we could, whatever happened during the Schützenfest that caused that exclusion, if that would not have happened, what would Charleston look like now? And that's not to say that we can never get to that, whatever that glorious picture is of all this inclusion and all that. But I think it's important that we all look back and then identify this issue that happened 150 years ago in order to kind of like achieve that glorious picture that we all aim to do.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Jamaal. We really appreciate that. And next, I want to move to Brian, Michael, and Peter. I found this to be a powerful way of demonstrating how research and the past connects to modern day issues, as Jamaal was also just mentioning. So where did your research come into the series? How did it develop over time, the project, and what types of sources did you all find?
Yeah, so Brian actually had first read about this historic Schützenfest, and specifically the one in Charleston, and brought it to Mike and my our attention, as like, wow, look at this crazy event that happened, during Reconstruction, and it was like this really positive, like glorious mixing of cultures in the city. Oh, sorry, my dog's here. Yeah. Mike, let me let you take it over real quick.
Sure. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, so Brian reached out with the source material about the Schützenfest. I can't remember the original source, but shortly after that, we dove into the Library of Congress archives. They have this great database of historic American newspapers from like 1774 to 1946, somewhere thereabouts. There is an author, Dale Van Wieren, who wrote American Breweries, and he has a website, oldbreweries.com. So we started sort of triangulating, okay, so like this Schützenfest really happened. There was really all this beer. There were really all these guns. The guns were just for marksmanship. There was no violence. Was there really? We started asking questions. I think our critical thinking came into play as we were picking it apart with Brian. So we knew that, we had enough archival material to put something together. But after a while, it was like, who do we know in Charleston? And who has this authoritative voice? And really, how do we center the African-American experience? How do we bring Gullah Geechee culture into this piece? Because for so long, that piece has been excluded in beer history. How do we bring it in, center that story, and take ourselves out of the limelight? Fortunately, Jamaal was very willing. I begged him to be our authoritative voice on lived experiences in Charleston. And so it basically was like boom, boom, boom. Brian reached out to us. We reached out to Jamaal. First was an email, then was a Zoom. Then we have a text chain that's been exploding for the better part of a year now. And it's wonderful. I get an endorphin squirt every time I get a text from Jamaal or Brian or Pete. And we've just been trading sources the whole time. Going way back to your original question, Brian started the source material with the Charleston Schützenfest. But of course, DC had a Schützenfest as well. And this took place around the old soldiers' home, Lincoln's Cottage today. So we're still researching literally to this day. Like earlier this morning, we were sending links and our take on them. And I'll send a link and say, what do you guys think? Or vice versa. So, we spent a lot of time reading, a lot of time processing these source materials, but really it was like Brian led the effort, Pete and I got involved, Jamaal got involved, and now we're just like one.
Thank you so much for going over how research progressed. It's so exciting to hear that there's more that you're finding and that you're continuing this project. I will say, for anyone joining in the chat, you'll see a link to where you can find the series. So I highly recommend, for more information, reading all 3 parts of the series and listening to the podcast. They're just incredible. So backing up to relationships between German immigrants and Black Charlestonians, I just want to kind of go back to that for anyone tuning in right now. Can you recap how the relationships changed over time, those dynamics, for everyone that's joining this evening that didn't have a chance to read the article? I noticed over time, they really shifted. Like earlier on, I know that they were, Black people were welcome at the Schützenfest. So I'd love for someone to kind of just explain those changes.
Yeah, I'll let Brian get into sort of the nitty gritty, but one thing that when he brought this to my attention first, that really struck me was that this innate segregation between African Americans and white Charlestonians, German American Charlestonians was not really like baked in. It was something that evolved over time. And it really reminded me of one of the great historical works of the sort of Reconstruction era, The Strange Career of Jim Crow by C. Van Woodward. And he writes a very similar narrative about how segregation laws and segregation in housing, schools, this was not something that was sort of born from the beginning, that in fact during this Reconstruction period, a lot of facets of society were much more integrated racially. But yeah, so Brian, I'll let you kind of get into the nitty gritty of the grocers and their relationships with the Black Charlestonians and enslaved Charlestonians as well. But it was just really an interesting connection between this sort of historiography that I've read about and then this experience in Charleston itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a fascinating kind of dynamic because this story, it by no means disrupts what we know and also what we like kind of think we know about kind of the racial hierarchy that existed in Charleston, but it does just give us a new way to look at it through this German American perspective. Before we continue, I do have to plug a historian named Jeff Strickland, who's a professor at Montclair State University up in New Jersey. He published a book called Unequal Freedoms, which covers German Americans and their relationship with the Black community in Charleston during this period. And he does talk a lot about the Schützenfest as well. We kind of added a beer angle and added in other historiography to do it, but his work was so instrumental that I do have to make sure he's acknowledged. And also encourage you to go read the book because it's a lot of fascinating stuff in there. Anyway, in the 1850s or so, when the Schützenfest was getting started, the German American population was kind of like this middling group in the broader racial hierarchy of the city. They were about 5% of the total city population, which overall was almost split down the middle between Black and white residents. And the vast majority of the Black residents, of course, were enslaved, although about 3,000 of them out of 40,000 total residents were not. And so the German American portion of this population, you may have thought that like, oh, they were just lumped in with the white population, but that wasn't really true. They kind of were not considered white. It basically depended on how much they played ball with white supremacy. If you towed the line and said all the right things, they'd treat you like a white person. If you didn't, then you were suddenly some other kind of skin color, some other kind of race. And this led to them having this really kind of weird relationship with the Black community because they didn't necessarily have to be bound by the traditional limits of white supremacy, right? They would do business with Black clientele in their stores. They would cohabitate, not often in a romantic way, although that did happen. But it might be like a working class German immigrant rents a room from a free Black family and like lives with them, or it could be vice versa, where the Black resident is the one renting the room, or things like that. I also understand that Charleston, while it was very heavily segregated during this time, it wasn't necessarily like there's the side of town that's for Black residents and the side of town for white residents. It was more segregated by house or segregated by street. So there could be a lot of chances to interact that in those types of ways they may not have expected. And so German immigrants tended to occupy a lot of the same neighborhoods as Black residents. And so they would have a lot of chances to see each other and work with each other and commiserate with each other, even though their experiences, of course, were very different. And so it was because of this kind of blended and unexpected kind of relationship dynamic that when the Schützenfest does get started, Germans welcome Black visitors because they're their neighbors, they're their friends, they're their customers in the case of the groceries, which I think you want to get to in a minute. So this really allowed for a lot of potential. If once Jamaal says keeps going, you're going to hear a lot about the potential, the lost potential of what could have happened if beer culture developed a different way. And this was how that potential was made possible, was by the fact that German Americans didn't necessarily fit into the binary racial fiction of Charleston, and that complicated a lot of things and led to a lot of whispers, and also a lot on the part of white onlookers, and also a lot of interesting friendships on the part of the Black and German communities at the time.
If I can add one thing about sort of German Americans, German immigrants, and the sort of differences between generations, it's that Brian kind of identified this, and he'll probably share credit with the author Strickland, and it's a wonderful book that was written. But the point being, if you were a sort of newly arrived immigrant, you might have what we would today describe as more progressive values. Let's say you work very hard, you work your way up, you own a grocer. And this is not just a grocery store like we think about the big grocery chains today. There would be beer and maybe whiskey. You might be licensed to sell both beer and whiskey on premises. And so if you're just starting out, you'll sell to whomever the customer may be. Whereas if you're an old guard, Brian talks in the podcast about the 1848 uprisings in Germany, and how if you came earlier, you might believe that, you know, this is effectively how white supremacy functions in Charleston in the 1860s, which is that, you know, we don't do business with African Americans. The old guard, the more conservative approach might be that. You know, comparatively to if you're of the new generation, you might think, you know, you might be more prone to certain set of ideals, and that may function how you do business. And I just think about my own family. So both my father and my grandfather immigrated to the United States from Prague. And it's very clear in my personal history, which has nothing to do with you know, this wonderful book or what Brian has researched. My grandfather was more conservative than my father, and you know, and that trend has continued throughout the generations. So I find a personal connection to it, as well as you know, this Black agency that was in Charleston at the time, which is basically like, if you wanted a drink, you could get one at a grocer. And I think, you know, once we got out of the research, once we got out of writing this, we really wrote this piece for ourselves. This is going to sound crazy selfish, but Jamaal wrote this piece, you know, as a team of four. Once we started to consider how this piece would factor into the sort of, you know, global audience that Good Beer Hunting has, it was like, how do we show that there was African American agency that was taken, you know, during this time of Reconstruction? You know, we kept finding these hideous things in the research, poll taxes and, you know, loans or financing, right? Like you might go to a grocer to get, you know, a bag of seed. And then of course, if you were Black, you would be charged more for that bag than if you were white or maybe German. But if you're a German immigrant and you're charged what the white customers are charged, that's effectively, you know, white supremacy. You've been let into the club, at least for one purchase on the grocer's side. So I'll end it there.
Thank you all. And something I want to reflect back to are these groceries. I was really struck by, you know, these commercial spaces and how they were really places where people would not only connect, but they were also spaces for Black agency. And also women come into the story too in a lot of these commercial spaces. So can you speak a little bit more about that in terms of, you know, why were they places where Black people and immigrants could connect? What did women have to do with this story as well?
Sure. So basically, commercial spaces were places where the boundaries of racial hierarchy and the kind of looming presence of white supremacy could break down in limited ways. And so one individual aspect that we looked at were these groceries. They were called Dutch corner shops. A lot of working class German immigrants could operate them. They weren't necessarily like big, you know, wealthy enterprises or anything like that. But that was a space where a Black resident could come in and order a drink and consume it the way that they wanted to and leave. And for that, and if that person was enslaved, which in most cases they would have been, that was a brief moment where they could exercise agency and almost feel free for the terms of a single transaction, as you know, limited as that is, unfortunately. And of course, you know, there were many other spaces like that in Charleston at the time. So, you know, you brought up what would essentially have been like the commercial markets. So imagine this is bustling market, lots of stalls, you know, lots of people trying to sell their wares. But if you were a slaveholder, you probably sent one of your enslaved people to that marketplace to do the work for you. And a lot of these cases, they were women. And this is not my own research. I'm branching out into research by Ashley Rose Young, who works at the Smithsonian and deserves all the credit for this. But a lot of those a lot of those salespeople would be women, and they were able to incorporate kind of West African methods of salesmanship, West African methods of negotiation, not just in the abstract of the marketplace, but literally against white customers, which in any other space in the city would have been a complete breach of white supremacy. It would have been, we'll say, frowned upon, which is, I don't know why I'm mincing words when these people don't deserve minced words. But in a marketplace situation, just like in the groceries, you could tear down those walls for a brief moment or for a brief negotiation, and that could be an incredibly empowering thing for the Black participants of those transactions. One more little one, this kind of gets into part 3 a little bit of the articles that we wrote, would be the mosquito fleet. Obviously, Charleston is a huge fishing town, or at least would and was at the time, of course. And the mosquito fleet were often Black boatsmen, Black sailors, Black operators. In a lot of cases, they were able to actually secure ownership of the boats that they were running, and they were able to do pretty fantastic things in Charleston's that helped define, the nature of Charleston as a fishing town, and by nature, its cuisine, by extension, all that kind of stuff. And so these commercial spaces were incredibly interesting sites to look at. And even though we just looked at the groceries because it involved beer, because it involved the Germans, it's part of this much larger tradition of negotiation in Charleston history that's just fascinating.
Thank you. And I know a lot of people tuning in probably are wondering what beer has to do with this story too. I found it so interesting when in the podcast, I think it was Brian who'd mentioned like a beer glass as a lens into history, like this phrase. So I just want to ask you all, where does beer kind of come into this story, and what does beer have to do with agency? And I will remind everyone that you can use the Q&A feature as well. If you have any questions, add them in on Zoom. Thanks, and we'll get to them at the end.
Go ahead, Jamaal or Pete. You want to take this?
Well, for me, beer comes in because, so I have to look at how I actually got into the space of beer. So if you think about it, the Schützenfest, you have all this exclusion going on. And fast forward, now you have me, whereas I kind of got into the beer industry by sheer luck, in a sense. I initially won a contest, and from that contest, I've kind of just been in all these different circles. And then having all those experiences, I reflect, and then beer was never in my face. Take college, for instance. I went to college, graduated undergrad, master's, and I got a degree, 2 degrees in education. It wasn't until I get into my late 30s that I realized, damn, the colleges actually have brewing programs. I would have loved to do that. If I was 21 years old in college, I would have absolutely have done that. So for me, for this project, I did a lot of looking at just being excluded and not necessarily knowing that I was, or not having the information and not even knowing that information was available. Like I said, if getting a brewing degree in college if I knew that was a thing in 1997 to 2002, I would have absolutely done that. So from my perspective, I'm looking at it as a more from a contemporary lens, as to I'm a result of that exclusion that happened back then. And so yeah.
Yeah, I think another way to track that, so that's very well said, Jamaal, is to look at spaces where exclusion still exists, and then other spaces where there's potential and opportunity that's been taken. So it's helpful, in my mind, to juxtapose Charleston with DC. According to Jeff Allworth, who is the author of the Beer Bible, he, along with Ruvani Da Silva, has put together this diverse brewery database. And they are tracking in 2021 breweries that are Black owned, breweries that are female owned, breweries that are Native American owned. They're tracking the data, which is wonderful in terms of brewery ownership, Black led breweries, et cetera. But the point being that Charleston, and according to their database, the state of South Carolina has 0 Black owned breweries. DC, and so this just announced that Imani, who is works at Right Proper Brewing Company, she's decided to open Urban Garden Brewing, and Urban Garden Brewing joins Sankofa and Sol Mega as the 3rd Black-owned brewery in DC, and that puts our number at 20%. 20% of the entire breweries in DC are Black-owned. It's the first female-owned. It's the first Black female-owned brewery in DC. So when you look at 20% of all breweries are Black-owned in DC versus the national average, which is closer to 1%, or the state of South Carolina, which is 0%, we kind of see what has been done with opportunity that's been provided, even though geographically DC, we're not that far from Charleston. We're just up the road, right? In the grand scheme of things. And I think to Jamaal's point, it's really interesting that the exclusion still exists today, because once we get at the root of the exclusion, which is, if you look around at the tap room and you see you see no Black faces, you might come to the assumption that Black people don't like beer. But that's a completely false assumption, and it's historically inaccurate, as Black brewers were some of the first in the United States. In fact, we found the first commercial brewery in Charleston had enslaved African Americans making the beer. The same for Alexandria, Virginia. The same. I mean, so the greater point is that African Americans have always been in American beer. There have been moments where exclusion was peeled back, but then white supremacy, effectively, white nationalism, buried all of the labor and all of all of the skills that were brought by Black hands to the trade.
And I think we were kind of talking about the agency of African Americans enjoying beer. That was kind of another side aspect of this. So we were asking, okay, what are they drinking at the Schützenfest? Both the German Americans, all the Charlestonians. It's German lager. So as the African Americans are excluded from that festival, the question is, okay, are they still drinking German lager? And I think we find increasingly that they're drinking a lot of these more indigenous beverages that are more native to African brewing traditions. So persimmon beer, for example, was one example. Sassafras beer, sarsaparilla beer. So beers using different ingredients than kind of the traditional German lagers, hops, malt, water, and yeast. And so talking about this lost potential, we also are thinking about, what if these African American brewers use these African culinary traditions and combine that with the German American and German traditions? What amazing beers might they have come up with 150, 200 years ago? So that's also, I think, very much part of like this lost potential of like, what could the American brewing scene look like today if not for this exclusion of all this knowledge over 150 years ago.
To add just kind of one final thought to what everyone has said so far, when we talk about Black agency in regards to beer, in regards to this story, or in regards to what can be done today, you need to think about it in two ways. One being, how is Black agency exercised? And the second being, how is Black agency prevented from being exercised? You have to look at that negative space, right? And a lot of our story involves looking at that second category. How was Black agency prevented from entering the equation? And that's a really important part, because what that does is it shifts our focus onto not just what was American beer culture, but rather how was American beer culture crafted and deliberately forged and created to be what it was. And a lot of those efforts have translated into the modern day to help us think of what is normal beer culture. You know, a lot of that was something that was created. It wasn't organic or natural. It was created very actively. And when you think about the exclusions that were inherent to that active creation, then what you're starting to do is recast the act of change. And by that I mean, if you're trying to change what American beer culture is, you're not taking something that is organic and was just sitting there and minding its own business, and now you're disrupting it. You know, you're taking a hammer to it. What you're actually doing is unmaking. What you're actually doing is correcting rather than disrupting, by undoing this work that went into creating exclusion. And that mental shift and how you conceive of what you're doing is critical if you want to actually see those things as valid and legitimate and useful. And I think I've said enough.
Thank you all. No, that's amazing. Thank you all for chiming in there and really thinking about like getting to the root of where this exclusion comes from. And actually echoing off of that, this is for Jamaal. In the podcast, you had a conversation with Mr. Sammy Backman, and I was really struck in that conversation when he's reflecting on history and this concern that his history might be erased. Can you talk a little bit more about that conversation and who Mr. Sammy Backman was in terms of the story as well?
So Mr. Sammy is a family friend. Like, I've known Mr. Sammy since I was 3 years old. And he and his family own Charleston and South Carolina's first fully Black-owned fishing company. They had their own dock, they had their own boats and all that good stuff. But you know, speaking, I wanted to lead with the beer, but I also wanted to talk about a city that I unfortunately love to hate. And it's the main reason why I left Charleston and moved to DC, was because like this mindset of exclusion, or Black people don't do this, white people only do this, it spawns out to all these different industries. And Mr. Sammy, like, I didn't know all the details behind it. I just, you know, I learned how to fish with Mr. Sammy, like all these cool things. I just really wanted to know, did he face those same obstacles? And sure enough, you know, he did. And like, it just, exclusion and racism in Charleston is just so strong. And like I said, it's the main reason why I left. So yeah, like, you know, Mr. Sammy is, the history with his family runs really deep. And I just really wanted to kind of not get too far off in the weeds, but kind of like just show how everything is pretty much connected as far as like the exclusion as it pertains to South Carolina.
Thank you for that. So thinking back to what you all were saying about getting to the root of this exclusion. So earlier, Brian, I know you mentioned that German immigrants weren't always considered to be white, and that this was the case actually for a lot of different immigrant groups, and this changed over time. So can you define whiteness and also talk more about how white supremacists use this and these shifting boundaries to create and maintain barriers for Black people in the beer world?
Oh boy, that's a mouthful. Whiteness, first and foremost, is a social construct. I also don't think that I should be the only one to kind of contribute to this definition. It's such a discussed thing that I hope that everyone else chimes in as well. But racism and white supremacy, of course, are social constructs that are created and imposed in order for the powerful to maintain power, right? And so as a result of that, they are arbitrary, and that means that their boundaries can be arbitrary, and they are created to serve a specific purpose. Whiteness in American history has been made and then remade and then remade again. So it's never just one static thing that is always there. And because it has such moving targets, it really kind of depends on the situation on the ground in any given location or any given time period to help help us understand or help reveal how white supremacists were using the term to their advantage. In the case of Charleston during the 1850s, basically Germans, I keep saying that they were in a gray area because they could be in the club sometimes, and they could be not in the club many other times. And it basically depended how well they played ball. Case in point would be a guy named Charles Werner, who was a German immigrant during the 1850s. He played ball very well in that he acquired enslaved servants. He used them to found an iron foundry in the city that became very successful. And what he was making, he wasn't just even making benign things like fence posts or whatever. He made shackles for jails in the city. He made armed wagons, I want to say, something to that effect, something that helped armed cannon, wagons with cannons mounted on them to serve in state militias and things like that. He used basically his enslaved labor and his iron foundry to literally uphold white supremacy. And then with the profits from that, he turned around and made what was called the Iron Palace, which is basically a giant beer saloon in the 1850s. It was very popular. It was multiple floors, concert hall, nice ornate saloon. It was kind of the social place to be. And it was, of course, built on all of this, on the backs of all this enslaved labor and from all this commitment to white supremacy. And what's ironic is that, the Iron Palace probably did more to proselytize and spread German American beer culture to the movers and shakers of Charleston than these German-owned groceries ever did. And that's just kind of speaks to the insidiousness of white supremacy and the power that it wields. Some of the German grocers who would be serving black clientele and literally getting prosecuted for it. Lots of these people were hauled to jail. Some of them turned around after the Civil War and invested in cotton plantations outside the city with the money they'd made from groceries, right? So exactly what whiteness is so hard to define, but it's so much easier to just see examples of it and the ways that it kind of infects everyday interactions until people you thought you knew are someone completely different, right? Please, someone else dive in with me.
Yeah, I'll hop in, Brian. So, defining whiteness is challenging, but the second part to the question, how does whiteness in the service of white supremacy restrict Black agency or the success of African Americans in the brewing industry? That one is not necessarily more easy, but we speak to it more in the pieces in the research we've conducted. And I think the point is that if Black hands have always been capable of crafting beer and making very good beer, and in fact, we're craftspeople, brewing beer, fermenting it, packaging it, and eventually selling it, we should have had the first Black-owned brewery in the United States at least as late as 1863. For a while, we thought 1970 was the first Black-owned brewery. It seems the goalposts are moving a little bit, and that 1955 may have, in fact, been the year of the first African-American-owned brewery in the United States. But that is effectively what white supremacy, what the ideological definition of whiteness is in service of white supremacy, and that is to exclude others from a systemic profiteering of keeping other races, classes, genders down. Yeah.
Thank you. And I know, Jamaal, you had mentioned, seeing remnants of this and the Schützenfest in Charleston. Do you want to speak to that at all, or with your experience with that?
So I mean, like I said, Charleston, when it comes to racism, is it's very well engraved. Like the neighborhood where I grew up, 4 or 5 houses down the street, there was a guy that had a noose on his porch. He had a noose hanging from his porch and a Confederate flag. And like I saw this every day. And I mean, you see Confederate flags all the time. Like it's really in your face. It's crazy though, because I've seen guys draped in Confederate wear, like open the door for my mom. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. And so it's also kind of weird like that. But like I said, I've always just growing up, I've always been in spaces where I was the only one. And a lot of times, when I say only one, like the only Black guy, and a lot of times like that would turn me off from things. Like I can remember 9, 10 years old, my mom took me to the local YMCA, and I was always been a good swimmer. And so I wanted, hey mom, I want to, get on try for the swim team. Okay, she takes me to the YMCA, perform well, basically beat all the kids I was swimming against. And my mom, asked me, "You ready to come back?" I was like, "Well, no, I don't know if I want to swim anymore." And I said that because I was the only Black guy there. So like a lot of times, like just growing up, South Carolina, being in the South and so conservative, like you just don't have, at least for African American kids, you don't have a lot of models outside of the norm. Like going back to my college years, like I got a degree in education because my mom has a degree in education. And in my family, I was the first person to graduate from college. My mom eventually went back, but I was the first one. So it's always like this practical mind state of how to do things. And that's only because of the racism, the white supremacy, the exclusion, because there weren't many opportunities. Going back to the beer thing, like I graduated from an HBCU. There are no HBCUs in the country that have fermentation and or brewing curriculums. And of course, I have an issue with that because in my mind, you're robbing kids of potential. I'm one of those kids. Like I should not have had to find my passion at 38. Especially if I kind of knew what I wanted to do as a kid all the time. Like my mom would always ask me, Jamaal, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? And my response was always like, I want to have fun. Now, of course, she would be like, boy, you need to know exactly what you want to do. But in my mind, like I knew what I want to do. Like, this is what I want to do. I get to meet people all the time. And this is a cosign to that. Like, I'm not the biggest church going guy, but there's a lot of divinity working with this project. Because you're taking something like a newfound passion for me in beer and a city that I love to hate and creating this song and dance thing. And it's beautiful that I can link with, Pete, Mike, and Brian on creating this thing, but it also there's a little bit of anger in there because it's like, I really don't even want to have this conversation. We should have this conversation. It's needed, but it's like, it's so unfortunate that we have to have this conversation because of a certain group of people think that they are superior than anyone else. So I don't know if that answers your question. I know that was a long road of things, but yeah, in sense, like directly in my face, have I faced any racism? Anyone calling me a certain name? Not so much, but I think the system in which I came up in, like really, I think now kind of like robbed me of a lot of potential. I'm here now, but like, the potential of 22, 23-year-old Jamaal.
And yeah, that idea of lost potential is definitely something that's echoed throughout the whole series and the podcast, as well as this idea that we have to really question these commonly held assumptions and narratives that are typically in place. So I know you mentioned the one, Black people just don't like beer, or women prefer wine, for example. So I'm just curious, how can we recognize and question these assumptions more, especially ones that have been so normalized and that have been, maintained so long over time?
I think that's it. I think anything is up for question. And like, where, like I was saying earlier, when I was speaking with my buddy KJ, and he asked the question. Prior to that, I've heard that question all the time, as at least from the Black side, from my African American friends. It was always, Jamaal, you always go, why are you going over there doing that white boy shit? It was always that kind of thing. And again, like a lot of times that was in jest, but like for whatever reason, that particular time I chose to really zone in on that. So I think everything is up for questioning. And if now that's not my reality now, as far as like women not consuming beer, whatever. Most women I know now drink a lot of beer. But I do know, I do remember a time where, just hearing women say, "Oh, well, I don't like beer," or I don't drink beer. Beer's nasty and all that. And it's like, ask yourself, why do you think that is? There's a lot of different moving ships as to why you may think that is. One, drinking mass-produced beer that's been stale, sitting on the shelf for a long time, or it's not necessarily marketed to you. So if it's not marketed to you, you don't see yourself, you're probably going to think that it doesn't belong to you. Same thing with the Black people may not like beer. Like, we're starting to see a lot of breweries pop up in these predominantly Black areas because, rent's cheap, a lot of warehouses, high ceilings, perfect for fermenters and bright tanks and all of that. So if I live in this neighborhood and it's predominantly Black and I've been here all my life, or I moved out, my grandmother still lives here, and then now one day I come back to my neighborhood and I see in this abandoned warehouse that's been there for over 30 years, now I see a sea of white faces in this Black neighborhood. People may look at that and think that, I don't belong there. Now, that's not necessarily my makeup because I understand like where, how often breweries pop up in neighborhoods like that, but people do look at that and think, I don't necessarily belong there. And that's not in their genetic DNA to believe that. That's a construct that's been in place specifically for Charleston for 150 years because we were methodically excluded from situations like that. And it's not just beer, it's fishing, it's cuisine. Charleston is a very, very big on tourism and in cuisine. And if you go to any restaurant in Charleston, they serve a lot of very specific Gullah Geechee dishes, red rice, shrimp and grits, all these dishes that are Black as hell in their creation, but like not Black in their manifestation or marketing. And all of that is by design.
Yeah, this idea of sort of like what we're trying to do, I think there's a strong difference between nostalgia, which is kind of what Charleston's tourism industry is selling, and history, which is kind of what we're trying to do, which is unpack and break apart some of these narratives that are just not true. I was listening to or kind of following along Professor Hassan Jeffries was giving a talk on the keynote for the American Association of State and Local History conference that was today, and he had a quote about Americans: "We hate history, but we love nostalgia." And so it's really an uphill battle to try and break through that those ideas about the past that lead to these stereotypes and lead to essentially, white supremacy, excluding African Americans from tap rooms, excluding Gullah Geechee chefs from the actual restaurants that are making this food and making the money from these economic spaces. So, to do that, I think it's important to tell these stories and to involve the people who live these stories now and bring back their ancestors, try and delve into what their truths were. So it's definitely an uphill battle, I think, but I think it's work that's worth doing.
Yeah, I would say just to question. Being a critical thinker is the best thing for all of our brains. It may be the hardest thing at the end of a long day, depending on when you start your day. If you've had a toddler who was up at 2 a.m. or whatever. But the point is always question and try to navigate spaces where it's not disrespectful to question. It's just you being a good critical thinker. I was listening to the podcasts. Jamaal was interviewing his friend KJ Kearney, and he was talking about like Gullah Geechee culture and what are some. Jamaal had asked KJ, what are some specifically Gullah Geechee things, and he was like, I don't know, how would a New Yorker describe what's New York like? And I started thinking, as a native New Yorker, I'm like, well, I'm a New Yorker. New Yorkers talk fast. Do I talk fast? Well, I kind of want a bagel. Do I want a bagel? I want a bialy. Bialy's a lot of dough. Bagel's a lot of dough. Bacon, egg, and cheese on a bialy, right? Like, and then it's like, it's asking a fish to describe water, right? But eventually the example that KJ gives is like rice. 3 meals a day I eat rice. I didn't know that was weird until I got with other folks, like college age, post-college, when after I graduated, like we love seafood. Like we love fish with the head on, with the bone in, with the ribs on. Like that is distinctively Gullah Geechee, but I would never think that until somebody was like, you eat rice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And that's kind of like, you know, if it smells fishy, which I love seafood as well, but like if it, you know, if it seems funny to you, question it and try to be in spaces where questioning is okay, not disrespectful.
Thank you all. Yeah, we've been working to question our original narrative here at the museum and making sure that we're adding stories of people who were not included in our story originally, but worked alongside of Heurich, like brewery workers and people that worked in the house, like household staff. So when researching, we often hit a lot of roadblocks. So I just wanted to know what kinds of roadblocks you all hit. Were there any absences or erasures that really stood out to you, and why do you think that those exist?
I mean, the absences and erasures exist for the same reason that white supremacy created what it did in Charleston's beer culture and in so many other, you know, kindred examples in American history. It would have been so great if a Black Charlestonian, you know, John Smith, the Black Charlestonian, had written a wonderful diary about all his years going to the Schützenfest, you know, starting in 1855, and the good time he had then, and then after the war, it wasn't quite the same anymore. We didn't have that because it doesn't exist, because so many barriers are put in John Smith's place, in his way, I should say, that made the diary either never get written, or if it was written, never get saved. I mean, you know, this is the tyranny of the archive for so many different historical questions, right? Whatever wasn't considered important at the time was not recorded, and Black perspectives were not considered important at the time. And so pretty much everything that we had to use for this project was told through a German lens or a white lens, and part of the point of this project was over time those two distinctions converged. And that's not okay. There's nothing we can do about it, but it's absolutely not okay. And it's something that we need to work around by looking into negative spaces, by reading between the lines, by calling out people, these past writers, in ways that they would not have ever thought they'd be called out. And also by not taking them at their word. And of course, I doubt I'm telling you, Jenna, you know, anything new about how to research, you know, the materials that you have at Heurich House. But generally, you know, historical research so often involves going against the grain, trying to challenge people from beyond the grave. In a lot of cases, it's a little cryptic and a little weird, but it's how we get interesting stories that we weren't supposed to get. And a really fantastic example of this that is not related to what we did here was written by Teresa McCullough, the resident beer historian at the Smithsonian just down the road. And she just published an article on good beer hunting last week that was all about researching a Black woman brewer from North Carolina named Patsy during the early 1800s, who basically she escaped her enslavement and spent years making a living as a brewer, among other vocations. And we don't know this because she left a diary or because any of the people in power wanted to preserve her story, but because Teresa had to read the silences and extrapolate so many details of Patsy's life by just using what she had on hand. And that's what we had to do. We were lucky to have a decent amount on hand. That's why the story could be so robust. But even what we had was all tinted by the perspective of the storytellers. And in some cases, those storytellers were some of the most vile racist people I've ever encountered. And that's saying something to a 19th century historian. But I didn't parrot what they said. I found ways to get useful, better information out of what they said than they ever intended. And that's what we all did.
Yeah, I'd say another big silence. You know, Mike and I are beer historians in the sense that we like to recreate old recipes, and so many of the actual recipes that enslaved people were using, or even in the 1870s, 1880s, the African Americans in Charleston, you know, we didn't really find those sarsaparilla recipes, the sassafras beer recipes. The one example that sort of proves the point is we did get a great description of a persimmon beer from Michael Twitty. He goes into great detail on that, but we get that basically through as an oral source that it's handed down from his father and his family from generations, and so that's kind of the only way we're getting that how to make that beer from him. And I think that kind of proves the difficulty that historians working with the written word have in trying to get at this history that's often not written down intentionally, and not, or if it is written down, not saved, as Brian has mentioned. And I don't know if Jamaal, if you want to talk, thinking of these missing spaces, if you want to talk about the Edmund Egan or not, but that's maybe for the future. But
you're a mind reader, Pete. Yeah. But so I think another form of erasure that we encountered presently, Mike earlier alluded to a particular brewery in Charleston that's named after a guy who had the oldest brewery in South Carolina, Charleston, or the first one. Yeah. And so they decided to name their brewery after this guy. And we actually found that he, in fact, enslaved people to brew his beer. 8 in all is what he says. So for that, that's also like a few different things moving right there, because I don't know if they knew how. I think specifically for Charleston, people can see history kind of like what you were saying earlier, Pete. They probably, people can see history like, oh my God, it's such a beautiful history, but there's always this other half that's never told. Like, these guys, for whatever reason, decide to choose this name for their brewery, but not necessarily taking in account of the 8 enslaved African Americans and what that means to a guy like me, for you to name your brewery after this guy. Is like, oh, this is a rebel brewery. He had the first brewery in Charleston. Yeah, but I don't know if I really want to come there and drink your beer now. But since then, I don't want to. This is not an out of this brewery that we're talking about, but conversations have been had, and it's like that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Like, we just need to tell the whole story. There's Charleston has a disconnect where it's like they capitalize off of the tourism, but like Charleston off of the history, but Charleston has so much blood on that history that's not talked about, and a lot of that blood is directly connected to African Americans, because slavery was so prevalent in the South, and specifically in Charleston, South Carolina, for so long.
Yeah, I would just add really quickly, echoing off Jamaal's point, we found tons of silences, and so we worked with what we had. But what Jamaal mentioned, Edmund Egan is known as the rebel brewer. And that's actually rebel as in rebelling against the English as a person in colonial South Carolina. The article we found came out in 1955, which ironically is the same date as maybe the first Black-owned brewery in the United States. But the article calls him the rebel brewer, says 8 in all, 8 enslaved people worked in his brewery. So if you think about the jobs in the brewery, if you've ever been there, they range all the way from, at this point in time, Egan, so we're talking the 1700s, 18th century, actually had bottles. And it maintained that bottling beer was a child's job basically up until 1916. We had child labor laws enacted in 1916. But thinking about the erasure there, Edmund Egan, rebel brewer, this was like, I'm going to botch the name, the Society of Southern, or the Charleston Journal of Southern Heritage, whatever it was. But this 1955 piece uncovered the lives of these people, and we're still trying to track down their names. We have the names of those who were property, the enslaved peoples who, Egan enslaved. But so we're trying right now to sort of triangulate to make sure the names match those who did the work. But to the point, in the brewery, you had very detailed work with mashing regimens and adding hops at a certain point in time to work that was a little more, easier, at least in theory, putting beer in bottles, tying the bottles up. And this was done at least until 1916. But I think about that erasure in regards to the local scene. So DC's first brewer was a man named Andrew Wales, and Andrew Wales had an enslaved brewer, a blind man named Wilkes, in his brewery. And if not for Wilkes dying in 1786, we might never know that the first brewery in DC that sold kegs to George Washington had a Black brewer making beer in Alexandria, Virginia, which at that point in time was considered part of the capital city. So it's tragic. I should like put a warning out, you know, like we're going to be talking about horrific things here, but we have to face this history if we want to progress forward and take these stories out of erasure and put them into the historical narrative.
Thank you all so much. You all read my mind because I was going to ask about the Edmund Egan and whether you're trying to uncover the names of the enslaved people that were brewing. So thank you all for touching on that. At this point, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them in to the Q&A. And one that came up is, did you research any, in your research in the grocery situation, did it bring to light any particular brands that had earned any affinity among these communities? And how did those brands feel about it? Any of them that this sort of diverse interest? And then I think Brian answered it, but if you want to share it with everyone, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I just finished typing. I didn't find a specific brand that was popular in Charleston or anything like that. The beer that would have been around at that time would have been shipped down the Atlantic coast from northern cities like Philadelphia or New York, which is where just like the vast majority of beer in the United States was made, at least in those states, not necessarily the cities, at that time. So eventually, you know, you see specific brands advertised like Bergner and Engels or things like that. Mike can speak to that a little better than I can. What I would kind of say though is that brand loyalty as we know it today, like, you know, being a Budweiser person or a Coors person, didn't quite exist yet. That was kind of more of an 1870s thing, invention, I should say. I have seen some affinity expressed for like specific sites of consumption, like if a brewer had a beer garden that they maintained, or if there was a specific saloon. You know, we love drinking beer at so and so's, but the type of the brand of lager, I don't think was necessarily quite as important. And then at the time, there was just so little differentiation about like, you know, lager. It was just lager beer. They didn't say, you know, it was a light lager or a Helles, or sometimes they would say a Bock, but that's because that's very different. So you know, lager was just kind of lager, I think, for a lot of people. And Mike, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're spot on, Brian. I would say brands are sort of entirely different in 2021 than they were in 1863, let's say. But also brand was lager, or the brand of beer was porter. And, you know, we talked a little bit about it, but like we know that Guinness, or Dublin porter, was imported to Charleston in 1817. 60 years later, let's say 1870s, we know that Bergner and Engel, who in their, so this is a Philadelphia brewery, and their marketing material, they claim to be the first brewery to own a locomotive, a refrigerated rail car locomotive, you know, and we still have to do some fact checking to see if that's just marketing or if that's real. It's kind of like, you know, greater drinkability or whatever. The point being that Philadelphia lager was imported into Charleston. Now you think of German brewers, you think, okay, they're making lager, but Bergner and Engel also had porter. So they must have known that, okay, well, you know, imported porter from Ireland does well in Charleston. So why don't we make what was imported 60 years before, because that's still selling, and why don't we try to hedge the market? You know, I have no idea if there was a sales meeting in Philadelphia to do that, but I can guarantee that there were weekly imports of beer from Philadelphia, stock ale, porter, and lager, and they were all coming into town. It's doubtful that the grocers specifically would have said, we serve Bergner and Engel beer, but they could have said, we know some marketing included, you know, Philadelphia porter, stock ale, or Philadelphia lager. And sometimes they go as far as to say the celebrated lager. And it's like, okay, who's celebrating? Like, is that purely marketing, or is that, so yeah, it's a great question about brands. And we know some things by date, but we are still figuring out the context of what brands mean in 2020 versus, 150 years ago.
And I'll also say it's notable that Charleston doesn't have the same sort of lager brewing tradition, in the city as other northern cities, primarily because the climate is so ill-suited. That, they're not growing as many of the ingredients there. Certainly the, hot, humid weather is not ideal for lager. It's great to drink lager, but it's not so great to produce lager. And so we're getting a lot of these imports from other cities. And so I think, maybe not having a hometown brewery, that's going to impact possibly brand loyalty, but it's also going to impact like how the brewing industry was sort of set up then, where you're having a lot of tied houses. So the saloons are serving, are owned by the brewery and serving that brewery's beer. And so there's sort of like a required brand loyalty in those situations that's not going to be at play in Charleston quite as much as in northern cities. But they're getting in addition to Philadelphia, they're also actually getting beer from Alexandria's own Portner brew house. So that's really from all different places, but certainly mostly from out of state, at least until we get to like the later 19th century. And then there's some other local South Carolina breweries that pop up, the Palmetto Brewery, and so it does change over time, but yeah, it's a very different beer city than some of the northern cities.
Great, thank you all so much. So another question that we have is, what lessons can we as a nation, especially in the current climate, extract from what took place in Charleston to better our society? And I'm going to add a question to that for you all. Can beer be a catalyst for change?
I don't know if we have enough time in the day to answer that question, but yes, beer can be a catalyst for change, I believe. But I think what we could learn from the Schützenfest and kind of like applying that to now is just the importance of access to information. So you look at now, we have this crazy pandemic still going on. And I can only speak from my personal experience. A lot of my friends, my African-American friends, don't want to get vaccinated, young, old, whatever. And on one level, it's easy to say, what, you're crazy, you should get vaccinated. People are dying, you're much more safer to get vaccinated. But then on the other side, I kind of get it. Full disclosure, I am vaccinated, but it's like, I get that. Like, my mother grew up Rock Hill, South Carolina in the early 50s, mid 50s and all that. She couldn't go to the doctor. She couldn't go to the dentist. She would have to go to the vet. Like, that's a real thing. Like, Black people could not go to the doctor. They would have to go to the vet for the doctor, for the dentist, all that stuff. And like, for the dentist, they would just pull teeth out. And like, to this day, and this is kind of messed up to say, my mother, out of all of her friends, she's the only one that has all of her real teeth, because she was just so anal about just like flossing and cleaning her teeth all the time. And she never, she goes to the dentist, but that's like, that comes from that. So you have a group of people that are not even worthy to walk into a hospital. So now, people's perception is just like, oh, well, no, I'm not going in there. And then you have Tuskegee. You have all these other situations that go on. And it's not necessarily their fault that they feel that way. And then that thought process is passed down. So if my mother felt that way, granted, I grew up going to the doctor and all that stuff and still do, but that's my mother, that's my situation. But there are countless other people that are like, you know what, no, we're not messing with that. So that's an issue that America needs to address. We're here now because of what happened then. You always got to go back to the root of the situation. Schützenfest is just one instance. we're just talking about beer, right? It ain't that serious, right? I mean, for me, it's serious. For other people, it's not that serious. But that same thought process goes on to beer, fishing, cuisine, healthcare, economics. I mean, can beer sustain communities? Absolutely, absolutely. Because we only think about that one tangible object, but beer can cover engineering, agriculture, entrepreneurship, science, biology, all these different things, and all these different things to where a lot of African Americans are not involved with. There's a disconnect there. So yeah, hope that answered your question, whoever asked that question.
And I'll add just a couple of data points. So we have been talking a lot about Charleston's Schützenfest and how exclusionary it became in the 1870s and 80s. Looking at DC's Schützenfest, it was probably a pretty similar to that early Schützenfest where all of the African Americans who flooded into Washington, D.C. during Reconstruction were probably allowed to join and participate. According to some sources we read that said that all patrons were welcome. So fast forward to today, Mike was mentioning that DC has 20% of its breweries are African American owned. I think those are just two data points, and we can't say because the Schützenfest of 1870 and 1880 allowed African Americans that today, we have a better history of Black brewery ownership, but you can't say that those are not just kind of interesting data points, I think, for possibly, can beer be a catalyst for change? Certainly DC has plenty of its own issues that are very much front and center. The fact that, we only have 20% brewery ownership, whereas our African American population is closer to 50%, that's an issue. The fact that the 20% of these Black breweries don't have the capital necessarily to have their own physical breweries, brick and mortar breweries, that it is definitely possibly an issue should they want to have brick and mortar locations. But I think you can see definitely a contrast between DC and Charleston, and beer is certainly part of that in some ways. Jamaal, I think you say that you had to leave Charleston and kind of have found a home in DC and Baltimore, and potentially that's part of this story for sure, is beer bringing people together and providing that community.
Yeah, I think a lot of the valuable things to learn from doing this kind of work or reading about this kind of work is it's not about necessarily the direct tangibles. Like, no one in Charleston today, regardless of background, is basing their beer decisions off of what they experienced in the Schützenfest in the 1870s, right? Because they weren't there. But there are so many
and almost nobody's heard of the Schützenfest before this piece.
I know, we found that out too. Very few people had heard of this at all. But at the same time, the residual effects of that in very intangible and very nebulous and almost unseen ways are affecting people's lives, are affecting the makeup of the city. And like Jamaal said, this is a beer example. This is just one of 1,000 million examples that makes Charleston what it is. But when you look into these things, it helps you challenge those underlying assumptions that you didn't know were there or that you didn't think were challengeable. This isn't something that I've encountered, so it's just something that is. Well, that's not necessarily the case. It's something that was put on you. And while this isn't necessarily a matter of looking to the Schützenfest to find out exactly what we tell breweries to do today, this is how you resolve your employee handbook or whatever. It is about starting conversations. It's about generating empathy, and it's about getting people to understand why they might just have these base feelings that they do, and whether those are good to have in the first place. And so, I swear I thought of this and I'm just now realizing that it fits really well with the title of the series. I mean, if you are, you know, a leaf, this kind of stuff is how you realize, hopefully not for the first time, but it's how you realize that you're part of a tree. And if and can you be the best leaf that you can be if you don't realize that you're part of a tree? I would say no. And this is part of how you accomplish that kind of work. So that's kind of what I would say.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been such an incredible discussion. I really appreciate you all joining today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. I highly recommend the podcast and the series. It's been linked a few times in the chat. So if you haven't copied it down, check that out right now. And again, thank you to our incredible panel. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of DC Beer Week. Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heurich House.
Thank you.